Archbishop Paul Gallagher.
I think we have to try and work on that to see if we can get through to North Korea in some way.
In my exclusive interview, a top Vatican official discusses the Holy See's stance on North Korea, Cuba, immigration, and other topics. President Trump's last day at the UN. He wraps up his first General Assembly. We'll have a report from the White House. Searching for survivors. Days after a strong earthquake in central Mexico, rescuers continue to search for signs of life. And the Pope's personal vocalists are in D.C. An inside look at the Sistine Chapel Choir as it continues its United States tour. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, September 21st, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. As leaders from around the world gather at the UN General Assembly, the Holy See is weighing in on global foreign policy. In an exclusive interview in New York City, I sat down with the Holy See's Secretary for Relations with States. Archbishop Paul Gallagher staked out a number of strong positions. We begin as the Vatican's de facto foreign minister sends a clear signal to President Trump. Archbishop Gallagher, thank you so much for joining me on EWTN News Nightly.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be with you.
The American Secretary of State says the U.S. is considering closing the U.S. Embassy in Havana, Cuba, because of an acoustic attack. The Holy See played a very key role in reestablishing relations after more than a 50-year freeze. I was in Cuba when President Obama visited and the embassy was open. If it closes, would the Holy See intervene again?
Well, we intervened, if that is actually the right expression. I would tend to say that we offered our good offices to two parties who were looking to consolidate the rapprochement that had already begun. And I think that if that were to happen again, if there were to be an approach to us to say, well, you know, there have been these difficulties, maybe we can facilitate something, certainly we're always willing to do that. We would like to see the progress and the hope that was brought about by this reopenness of the United States to Cuba and what all that symbolized, not just for the two countries, but for the world, not to be lost. At the same time, I think you have to obviously, the American authorities have to take responsibility for their people who are on the ground there, and these are serious matters. But one would hope that some way could be found to make sure that the great advances that were achieved a couple of years ago can be preserved for the future and built upon.
The United Nations Security Council imposed sanctions on North Korea following multiple tests of a nuclear device. And the president of South Korea, who's Catholic, earlier this year asked Pope Francis and the Vatican to bring peace to the Korean peninsula. As tensions continue to escalate, is Pope Francis going to try to intervene? Will the Vatican intervene in this current crisis?
Well, the Pope is always willing to do anything that is asked of him and which we believe is going to be effective. My particular view at the moment of the Korean crisis is it is fundamentally a crisis of communication. In that we cannot resolve this because there is very little real communication going on. So I think that is the thing that we are trying to break through into. Now, to be honest, at the moment there are not many initiatives, but if some opportunity were to present itself, I'm sure that in coming weeks, coming months, how this crisis unfolds, the Holy Father will be adding his voice to this thing, his appeal and his prayers. But we just have to see what opportunities present themselves. But I think that that is, at the moment, the principal difficulty is that can we talk to the North Korean leadership? And today I've heard at the UN, many appeals to him, to stop this thing, to back down. But at the moment, it all seems to be falling on deaf ears. What we have to do, perhaps, is ourselves listen to what's coming from there and try and bridge this gap of non-communication.
Venezuela is in real crisis right now, and President Maduro called President Trump Hitler after President Trump's speech. The Secretary General is supporting efforts to negotiate this human rights crisis. Pope Francis has voiced his concern about the situation. He met with Venezuelan bishops on his recent trip to Colombia. On his way back to Rome, he also said that the UN should make itself felt in alleviating this humanitarian crisis. How do you plan to convey the Pope's appeal for a greater UN presence on the ground?
I'm going to talk to the Secretary General in the next couple of days. I have an appointment with him, so I will be talking to him about this and about other conflicts in the world in which we feel the UN could be playing a greater role.
Are there other countries other than Venezuela that you are at liberty to tell me where you are going to be requesting a greater UN presence?
Again, I believe that in the North Korean, the crisis in the Korean Peninsula, I think the UN could be a very good broker to try and help us with this communication problem, because the Secretary General does represent the community of nations. He does represent, in one sense, everybody and nobody. So I think we do feel something could be done there.
Later in the show, the Archbishop comments on President Trump's pro-life stance. And tomorrow, in part 2 of our interview, the Archbishop talks about migration and the importance of protecting Christians and religious minorities around the globe. As the threat of North Korea looms large, President Trump is taking one more step to crack down on the rogue nation over its nuclear weapons buildup. It comes in the form of an executive order. Correspondent Mark Irons has more from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The president's last day at the UN General Assembly has been a whirlwind of meetings with heads of state from Afghanistan, Ukraine, Turkey, South Korea, and Japan. The president has called for peace this week, while also issuing an aggressive appeal that the world's righteous many confront what he calls the wicked few.
Today I'm announcing a new executive order I just signed.
President Trump pledges more pressure on North Korea as he meets with U.S. allies, the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of South Korea. The South Korean president complimented the president's speech to the UN, calling it very strong and saying it would help change North Korea.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
This week, Trump also forcefully condemned the governments of Iran, Syria, Cuba, and Venezuela.
It wasn't a consistent, clear message.
Blaise Mishdahl, a national security expert, says the president is pushing his America First policy while telling other countries what to do.
Sovereignty is good, we're going to do what we want to do, you other countries do what you want to do, and then saying, well, actually, we want to work together, or we want to tell other countries that they can't build nuclear weapons or that they should limit their nuclear programs. I think that's still going to be a tough sell.
But former presidential advisor Sebastian Gorka, who says he helped craft the president's speech, says Trump is popular because of his harsh rhetoric.
There's a reason he was elected president, because of the things he said in that speech.
Gorka says the president has made it very clear that when it comes to North Korea, he will do whatever is necessary to protect U.S. lives. And he calls Trump's UN debut historic.
This probably will go down as a historic moment because it's a clarion call for the United Nations to return to what it originally was. The United Nations should concentrate on true measures to provide stability and safety for all its members.
President Trump's latest executive order targets individuals and entities that engage in trade with North Korea and the financial institutions that facilitate that trade. The president hoping to halt the unstable country's nuclear weapons program. He says tolerance for this disgraceful practice must end now. Lauren.
Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House. Thank you, Mark. Special Counsel Robert Mueller now wants to look into documents related to President Trump's actions in the Oval Office. Sources tell CNN Mueller wants documents and emails related to the dismissals of National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and FBI Director James Comey. Mueller is investigating the Russian interference in last year's election and whether Trump campaign associates colluded with Moscow. A race against time in Mexico City as rescue workers try to save everyone they can. The death toll is now at least 250 people. That's after a massive 7.1 magnitude earthquake that rocked the region Tuesday. Nearly 2,000 were injured. Many more have been forced from their homes. Mexico has declared 3 days of mourning. Hurricane Maria is devastating the Caribbean, killing at least 15 people. This video shows the widespread destruction across Puerto Rico. The force of the storm knocked out the island's entire energy grid. A bishop from the Democratic Republic of Congo is pleading with Congress to heal a political stalemate in his country. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi tells us why the bishop needs Americans to help.
Lauren, Congo's president sparked a constitutional crisis when he failed to step down at the end of his term last year. The country's bishops attempted to broker peace. Now they're looking for outside help. One of them here on Capitol Hill urges lawmakers to act.
Kids just being kids. But in a country rocked with violence and political confusion, forcing millions to flee their homes, Congolese Bishop Nicholas Jomo brings their stories to the Capitol.
It's very tough for us to see people suffering so because of the war, because of the poverty, because of lack of liberty. It's very, very tough for us.
Opponents of Congolese President Joseph Kabila say he's trying to power grab away the country's promised presidential election. Bishops brokered a political deal in December to prevent civil war and foster elections. They backed away in March, saying the agreement was ignored. Now Bishop Jomo asks Congress to intervene.
The United States is the first power in the world that have a responsibility to help in many ways they know they can. And we are hoping that they will continue to push our government so that the elections could have to take place as soon as possible.
Bishop Jomo says he's sure elections will not take place this year. He's pushing to end the stalemate and have the country finally elect its president by the middle of next year. Lauren?
Correspondent Jason Calvi at the Capitol. Thank you, Jason. Coming up, the controversial law in Oregon making abortions free for everyone in the state. We'll talk to the executive director of Oregon Right to Life on legal actions being taken to reverse the law. Earlier this week, the governor of Oregon praised a new law in her state providing free abortions regardless of income or citizenship status. Insurance companies are now required to cover abortions at no cost to the patient. Opponents say this forces taxpayers, even those who object morally to abortions, to assume some of the costs. Joining us now via Skype is Lois Anderson, executive director of Oregon Right to Life. You fought that law. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Why do you believe taxpayers will assume these costs?
Well, first of all, Oregon is one of the few states that does provide abortion at state taxpayer cost already. And this new law actually pushed that further by requiring insurance companies to provide abortions at no cost. So we believe that insurance rates will go up, and also it included an additional amount of money to pay for abortions that would not normally be covered or under the Oregon Health Plan, which is most likely related to immigration status.
So basically, it is without. It is without your. Doesn't matter your status. It doesn't matter if you're legal,
Correct.
if you're not legal. It doesn't matter your age. Is that right?
Correct. It does not matter your age. We have no laws in Oregon that prevent any abortion from happening for all 9 months of pregnancy.
Is this law constitutional?
We do not believe that it is. We believe that it violates the Constitution on religious liberty grounds and on associative grounds as well.
How does this bill affect the pro-life movement? What are you going to do? Are you going to fight this? Are there any loopholes?
Of course we're going to fight. They did a very good job of writing this law to prevent loopholes, but we are working very hard with some very smart lawyers to figure out every possible way that we can fight this law in the courts, whether it's administrative rules, whether it's in the legislature, and on the ground, actually, with individual people counseling women who are pregnant.
Thank you so much for joining us and that update on the status of pro-life in Oregon. Lois Anderson, Executive Director, Oregon Right to Life.
Thank you so much.
In my exclusive interview with Archbishop Gallagher, a top Vatican official, we talked about the Pope's comment that President Trump presents himself as a man who is pro-life. And we asked him if the Pope questions President Trump's pro-life belief.
No, I don't think so. He was, that was a quote from the press conference on the plane. And he was linking it in then to the migration question. And he was saying that the president should be sensitive to the fact that in migration policy, you have to be aware of the impact upon families. And so I think that was my interpretation of it, that he was saying the family is the fundamental unit of life in society. So then you have to also be, if I like, pro-life, pro-family. And if there is a danger of doing damage to families through policy, then one has to think long and hard about it.
And tonight on EWTN's Pro-Life Weekly show, host Catherine Zeltner will highlight a camp with no limits. It's a summer camp for children who've lost limbs.
I've always wondered whether I was just alone with my condition, but Camp No Limits has helped me realize that there's a lot of kids out there like me, and it's just a really amazing camp.
The camp has 10 locations nationwide. You can see more tonight at 10 p.m. here on EWTN. Pro-Life Weekly re-airs Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Up next, the Sistine Chapel Choir comes to the U.S. A look at last night's performance and what it took to bring the Pope's Choir to America. Today is the feast of St. Matthew. Born in Galilee, Matthew was a Jew and a tax collector. He was one of the 12 apostles and one of the 4 evangelists. You can head to the News Nightly Facebook page right now to view a reflection about St. Matthew by our EWTN News Nightly chaplain, Father Patrick Mary. The Holy Father met today with his Sex Abuse Advisory Commission, a group of outside experts who advise him and the Church on best practices to keep pedophiles out of the priesthood and to protect children. Cardinal Sean O'Malley, Archbishop of Boston, heads the commission. The panel was named in 2014 and is made up of clergy, religious, as well as lay people. In its 3 years, the group has held educational workshops in dioceses around the world and made proposals on how to keep kids safe from sexual predators. Juliet Lindley is EWTN News Nightly's Vatican correspondent. She joins us from Rome. Juliet, it's the first time Pope Francis has met with this commission. What did he say to them?
Well, he promised to respond with the firmest measures possible against clergy members who rape or molest minors, and he underlined that religious superiors who turn a blind eye will not be allowed to get away with it. Now, Pope Francis, perhaps for the first time, admitted that the Church was late in dealing with the sex abuse issue, and he reiterated the zero tolerance pledge and the fact that that he had approved new rules to sanction bishops who turned a blind eye to pedophiles.
Cardinal Sean O'Malley, the Archbishop of Boston, heads that commission. What did he tell the Holy Father about the panel's work to date?
He said they had strived to promote responsibility at every level in ensuring the Church is a safe and secure home for all. They had carried out training programs for church leaders, and they drew up guidelines with the local churches to help ensure that minors are protected.
Juliet, can you remind our viewers about the background of this commission and what does it exactly do?
Now, it was set up in 2014, and it's made up of a panel of mainly non-church experts, psychologists and sociologists, who advise the church on how to keep pedophiles out of the priesthood and how to protect minors. Now, it made the headlines in March of this year when its most prominent member, abuse survivor Marie Collins, resigned. And she resigned saying that there was frustration because there seemed to be a lot of resistance to some of the Commission's proposals. Now, the Commission's statutes and membership are up for review, and it's still not clear whether abuse survivors will be included in the new lineup.
Well, I think the most important message here is what the Pope has been saying over and over again, which is zero tolerance. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren.
After more than 3 decades, one of the oldest and most prestigious choirs in the world returns to the United States. The Sistine Chapel Choir is on a tour and made a stop right here in our nation's capital. Look who was lucky enough to be there. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee joins us from the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, where they performed last night. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. For many Catholics here in the U.S., this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. The Sistine Chapel Choir usually performs in the Vatican at papal masses, but this week Americans are getting a chance to see them in person.
The sounds of classical Renaissance music filled the sanctuary inside the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. This group of 30 boys and 22 men is known as the Pope's Choir because they sing for the Holy Father's liturgies. Mark Spiropoulos is the first Englishman since the Reformation to be hired as a full-time singer.
Music is a way in which we can connect to people that don't necessarily understand the words. And we have to direct their minds to consider something which goes beyond the everyday, the banal, to the transcendent.
Bob Schwartz of Michigan says that's the reason his company is sponsoring the choir's U.S. tour.
People are searching for truth and beauty and goodness, and sacred music of this caliber really allows people to reach that, to achieve that.
Timothy McDonald, the director of choral activities at the Catholic University of America, hopes the choir's historic trip will inspire American Catholics.
This is a real encounter with history and the history of the Catholic Church, and in particular the history of the papacy.
Grayson Wagstaff, the Dean of Music at Catholic, is conveying that history to students.
We want students to add to this tradition by composing their own new music to celebrate the faith or to do research on the importance of the Church's traditions.
And it's that celebration of the faith that continues to draw audiences wherever the choir travels. Spiropoulos says it's an honor to be a part of the group.
There's no other choir that I've come across that sings quite like this, that has such an intense feeling, a real living and breathing of this kind of music. They have such a feeling for what they're doing and a real passion for it, and that excites me a lot.
The trip has been described as a pilgrimage, not only for the Catholics coming to listen to the music, but for the choir as well. This was the second of 3 stops for the Pope's Choir. This weekend, they'll perform at the Detroit Opera House. If you want all the information, just log on to SistineChapelUSTour.com. Lauren?
Thank you so much, Wyatt Goolsbee. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from inside the National Basilica. EWTN will air the Washington, D.C. Sistine Chapel Choir concert on October 22nd. It will feature the full performance, as well as interviews with Dr. Jacqueline Leary Warsaw, host of EWTN's In Concert series. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you so much for watching and listening to that beautiful music. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We leave you tonight with more of it from last night's Sistine Chapel Choir concert right here in Washington, D.C. Good night, and God bless you.